Welcome to Sword and Shield, the official podcast of the 960th Cyberspace Wing. Join us for insight, knowledge, mentorship, and some fun as we discuss relevant topics in and around our wing. Please understand that the views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the U.S. Air Force nor the Air Force Reserve, and no endorsement of any particular person or business is ever intended.
All right, welcome to the Sword and Shield podcast. I'm Colonel Rick Erredge, 960th Cyberspace Wing Commander, and today I have a special guest, Tech Sergeant Daniel Hulter. He's the co-host of Disruptive AF podcast, and he's really a leader in the innovation space. So we're really excited to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, so I stumbled upon a podcast, the Disruptive AF podcast, through an email I received through formal channels, through government email. And so I hit it. I was interested. I got super excited when I listened to the first episode there. So, and you guys are really talking about the things that I really try to operationalize inside of a wing. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion today about how we can take innovation and give our unit members an opportunity to really live it. And really, it's about solving problems in my mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like to, a lot of people like to try and figure out a good definition for innovation, and I like to keep it broad. My favorite definition actually is just novelty with impact.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we are in mission space in the cyber world where there's plenty of opportunities to be novel and solve problems. And 16th Air Force actually is trying to move to this concept of convergence, where we're bringing multiple capabilities and people together to solve problems for our nation's leaders. And so it's moving away from the weapons system concept into using people's brains to be creative and solve problems. And so one way to do that is get people to think differently about the business. And so I know that the first podcast I listened to you guys, you spent a lot of time talking about what does disruption mean and how leaders look at that. And how did you get into the innovation space, and how were you interested in this topic as much as you are?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to just kind of tell my innovation origin story. I am a Chinese linguist by training in AFSC. I've been in for about 16 years. And for the first, I think approximately 10 of that, I was just operational intel doing translation work. But for the entirety of that time, I was well aware that technology and processes should be capable of doing more things than they were, because they were kind of hamstrung by the way we did business, by the bureaucracy, and also by the slowness of our acquisitions processes. For example, I spent a lot of time in tech school learning Chinese, and I used to be able to use this wonderful tech that once I went into the operational Air Force, I was no longer able to use. And I felt like I was moving back in time to actually, like using tech that was from 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is frustrating for somebody who's well aware of what technology should be able to do for them. So it's kind of a disgruntled innovation type at that time. And I think there's a lot of us out there, especially with the younger generations. They just spend so much time interacting with technology in their daily lives that they know what the gap is between the present state for the Air Force and what would be possible if we just got modern technology and used modern processes. So around 11, well, so I've always run into these policy issues with specifically with the Exceptional Family Member Program, and I ran into a really big one about between 10 and 12 years into my career, and it was going to separate me from my family at a time when my daughter was on hospice, and she ended up passing away about a year and a half ago, but for a majority of my career, she was alive, and I was dealing with these really rigid policy problems that just didn't make any sense to me. And that sort of, there was a moment where I was kind of like, well, I'm either going to end my career or I'm going to solve this problem. And I wasn't, the Air Force was trying to send me on a 3-year unaccompanied tour while my daughter was actively dying. And it just didn't make any sense. But nobody could seem to figure out how to resolve this issue. So one of the things that I did was I studied a lot of what causes organizations to be capable of innovation, because I was really confused about what was happening here. Like we all understood that this didn't make logical sense. And there should be a solution, but we couldn't figure out how to make that happen. And I was running into, what's often called the frozen middle.
Yep.
We ultimately ended up being able to solve that problem, but it took 3 years. It, got me a lot more bitter for a little while there. And then having kind of educated myself on innovation, organizational innovation strategy, I talked my way into a position standing up an innovation cell at the wing level. So I was the NCOIC of innovation for the wing cell. And that gave me the opportunity to dig into the tactical level practices that facilitate innovation. So creative problem solving methods, facilitated practices, things like Scrum and Agile, and modern practices that just increase the adaptive capacity of a workforce. And after doing that for a while, I went on to another assignment where I was doing intel work again. But during that time, I started a community of practice for facilitation of things like design thinking and other design methods. And that got me the attention of the leadership at Air Force Cyberworx, who then plucked me out of my assignment where I was and brought me to Cyberworx, which is where I am today. So now my full-time job is at Air Force Cyberworx as a facilitator and a designer. And so I've been here for about a year. I got a couple more years of doing what Cyberworx does, which is apply human-centered design methods to Air Force problems. So that kind of brings you to where I am at this point.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter.
Thank you.
That's terrible. And trying to figure out how to navigate that space at a time like that, you're dealing with grief, let alone trying to figure out the policy. So I can't even imagine trying to deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It informed a lot of how I think about leadership as well as innovation today.
Yeah, I have seen recently, and of course, the reserve doesn't participate in EFMP just because we don't have assignment systems like that. But I have seen a number of at least some messaging about changes to the EFMP program, and of course, having some partners here that are RegAF partners that are dealing with things not as grave as yours, but their frustrations as well. Even 06s and 07s can't solve problems. Hopefully, you've made a difference there.
Absolutely. I was really actually pleased to speak to the office at AFPC in the subsequent years after that period, that they have invested a lot more in looking at preventing the kinds of situations that we had. I actually did a TEDx. I gave a talk at TEDx Hickam on the subject of, I kind of told that story of that policy issue and the things that caused it to resolve, or the things that caused it to be the case in the first place, which is that any environment, things change and you have to keep revisiting the value that you were intending to create, and make sure it's not violating that value. And then the things that will actually resolve that. So if you're interested, I could share a link to that talk. Because I'm really, honestly, I've always just been confused about the the disparity between what people know should be the case and their ability to make it happen. It just didn't make logical sense to me. And so I dug a lot into the motivational incentive factors. I ended up reading a whole lot of books on the subject of innovation, and that's kind of what got me to where I am these days.
Yeah, that's awesome. When I'm an 06 now, and as a reservist, oftentimes policies are built for the regular component and they don't fit neatly for us. But yet I'm on active duty, right? And so I become frustrated as well, and struggle at times when I say to myself or other people, like, that just doesn't make sense. Like, that defies common sense.
Yeah.
Like, why are we doing something like that? And I ask why. And I kind of feel like sometimes even me as an 06, like, I'm afraid to ask the why. Like, I'm going to challenge somebody's that this has been their policy or their baby, or they're going to say, you just don't understand, or it doesn't apply. And so I fight that urge myself in order to keep pushing, because in the end, I'm usually trying to solve a problem for an airman for something that just doesn't make sense, and we're wasting a lot of time on. How have you found that approach of being persistent, and how do you keep yourself going and just continue to fight through the bureaucracy to solve problems?
Yeah, I'd say that the persistence element was what has resolved like the most severe problems that I've experienced, because some things never get resolved until you outlast the people who are defending the status quo, which, because they actually don't have to exert that much energy to defend the status quo. It is much easier. They have a much easier job because the return on investment for continuing to do things the way they are is apparent and it's known, right?
Yep.
Whereas the second you start tearing things down, you're inviting entropy. You're opening the floodgates to a whole lot of unknowns, and that looks to people like risk, right? So for people who believe it's their job to protect the institution from risk, which a lot of program managers, that's within their job description, right? I've seen a wing commander say, we're going to do this thing, and say it directly to our office that, okay, go ahead, you have my approval to do this. And we were directly reporting to wing commander. And then one of his staffers refuse to make it happen. And from their perspective, he didn't have the authority to do that. And so it was a really interesting, I had to really empathize with that person. Most people don't most people don't go the step of empathizing with those stakeholders and go, what is it about this system that causes that person to have this mindset? Usually there is a very reasonable systemic basis there.
Sure.
Which is, so I think this brings me to what I do believe is the ideal, if there is a toolkit for getting after, wicked problems within a bureaucracy, it is using methods that are human-centered and incorporate empathy for stakeholders. Specifically, like, I'm trained up in a couple of design thinking methods. I encourage people to not let any one individual try and tell them what the definition of design thinking is, because it is a lot of things in a lot of different contexts. But human-centered design and design thinking, one thing that's really very clear is that you start with the ethnographic, like, lived experience of the people being impacted. And that might include the stakeholders who are expected to implement or execute the, whatever you're trying to do. And until you get really familiar with what their needs are and what the context within their, within which they're supposed to have the desired behavior, you can build something that works in theory, and then you put it out there and it just doesn't happen. And that's a really frequent thing, actually. It was a very common problem in software development with waterfall methodologies, where you build a massive list of requirements and then you spend millions and millions of dollars building this software package, and then you put it out there. And there have been a lot of cases. The book Scrum talks about a famous one, I think maybe even in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, where is an FBI system that got fully built and then was never used because it didn't work, because methods that don't incorporate the user participation and feedback process are prone to be full of incongruities with their lived experience. So so when you're talking about like the frozen middle, you're usually talking about people who are, in a sense, stakeholders or users who were not brought in early enough in the problem solving process, which is something that's resolved by using methods like design thinking.
Yeah, that's outstanding. I've had my own spent a little bit of time in organizations in terms of software development, and was right several years ago, 2016, 2017, we were switching from waterfall to agile, and it was hard even to get the developers to move to something different, to understand, like, I got to talk to my customer, like, that's important. Because and nobody wants to waste their time and effort, but it was just a different mindset, and we wanted to unleash them, and we took the biggest complainer and the person that had the most vocal feedback and said, help us fix this then. We want to be able to meet your need. And it didn't take long, actually. The developers moved much quicker to, hey, this is really going to make my job easier, and I'm not going to waste time doing something or rework something. And so they got to the point where the customers were like, hey, can we formalize this a little? Like I can't keep getting tagged all the time for input on your, I'm trying to be the SME in my program. And so we had to rebalance that a little bit, but it was amazing to see the change in a short period of time if you have the right people.
And I'd say, like, a lot of this is a really general idea. It was something that you just hit on, is the idea of outputs versus outcomes. Software developers in a waterfall context are focused on outputs. They're given a something that they have to build that has to function in a specific kind of way, right? That needs this list of features. And it needs, there's probably some mock-ups that say it needs to look something along these lines. And when they get those, once they've built those, the product, the artifact, they're done, because their job is an output. But when you make it everybody's business to reach an outcome, then no matter how much you've built, if you still haven't solved the user's problem, your job is far from done. And that's why in Scrum specifically, the idea, that it's very similar to the minimum viable product idea, where you want to figure out, how can we create something that will create tangible value right now, immediately, as soon as possible. Every sprint has to be about the creation of value. And that's at the heart of what human-centered design is it's tying your effort to outcomes rather than outputs.
Yeah, that's what when we implemented, we went with Scrum first, because we were kind of just trying to figure it out, frankly. And we didn't have a lot at that time. There wasn't a ton of people to lean on that we knew about. We had a contract force, and trying to deal with the contractors too, and interact with the government. And so I think it worked out well, and I think they're doing great work even today, and they're all bought in. So in many of those cases, I think we've had success on small scale. But how do you deal with, like, the disagreeable people, even if they're just flat out, like, for whatever reason, entrenched or just want to be difficult? Like, have you any techniques or experiences that you've seen that have worked to either on the customer side to get them on board to participate in the process, or just from inside the org, how we can get?
Honestly, so when you say disagreeable, one of the first things that pops into my head is that disagreeable people drive innovation. And that comes from, I think I got it specifically from either Malcolm Gladwell or Adam Grant. Adam Grant's book Originals is really good in that regard. But the idea of being disagreeable is on like the big five psychological personality scale. Disagreeableness is the willingness to kind of ruffle other people's feathers. It's the ability to just not worry about social pressure, not let social pressure impede you from speaking out. And one of the things that I realized, as I was studying innovation, is that if I did a personality test, I'm sure that my level of disagreeableness would be very high. And that's one of the things that I think makes me the innovative type. So and the reason that I'm starting with that is because like the threshold for me, something doesn't have to be that out of whack for me to point to it and go, that's stupid. We should not do that. Right. What some people might consider to be socially inappropriate, and they just ignore flaws in the system for the sake of going with the flow. Disagreeable people are those people who have a ton of ideas about, the ways in which we can improve things. So some of those disagreeable people are in positions of, where they're in defense of the status quo, and bringing them over to the side of change. I think it's kind of what I was saying earlier. It's all about understanding the basis for why they believe the status quo is less risky, and making the case that the status quo is actually higher risk than adapting to a changing environment. Some of that is going to be about them personally feeling like it's riskier to their position to step out and do things that might fail, right? So long as you are maintaining a system that somebody else built, you can't ultimately be blamed for what happens within that system. You were put in charge of maintaining this, right?
Yep.
So that makes it a personal risk to go and start making changes and dismantling what people before you, who might have been smarter than you, built for the way things were then. So you have to come up with some kind of, means of bringing them over, feeling like, no, actually, I don't want them to feel like personally at risk, like you're threatening them, but almost to that degree at points where it's like, this is some of the power of senior leadership messaging. It's like, if you're not, accelerate, change, or lose. I actually really like that language, although I believe it was the original pitch was accelerate, change, or die.
Yeah, that gets it.
So, yeah, but the reason I like that is because that evocative, like visceral language, it should make people feel, the messaging coming from senior leaders should make them feel like I am more at risk to maintain the status quo than I am to, be making changes. And then you have to figure out, and I think it's different for different individuals, which is why there's no standardized thing, which is why in user experience design, we interview, and in design thinking as well, you'll go and do a 1 hour interview with a stakeholder or with a user. And a significant portion of that is figuring out what motivates them to behave in the ways that they do. Because in many, many contexts, and you brought up earlier that it's not about a widget. In many contexts, in almost every context, I'll say, innovation fails without behavior change. Yep. If you introduce a new technology and behavior doesn't change, it will fail. It will not be implemented. This happens in Agile all the time. If you implement Agile frameworks in a software organization, but they don't change their values and the way that they interact and their communication structure, if all of that, the patterns of culture and all of that does not shift to support the new, what you just installed, it will fail. It'll be rejected like a donor organ, right? And so if you can't spend some time really getting to the heart of what motivates people to remain in the behaviors that they are, you won't have any hope of convincing them to adopt new behaviors that feel risky.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And sometimes I feel like I'm the disagreeable person all the time. And I'm like,
Yeah.
as a senior leader here, I kind of feel like that's my role. And with other senior leaders, I personally struggle with trying to get them to me, it's clear. And so this is really helpful for me to understand it from a risk perspective, to try to try to understand it maybe from their perspective as well, where they sit in their view of the world, and try to articulate it well enough to make our point that, in the cyber business, things change so fast and so rapidly, and technology emerges so fast that we need to be, super agile.
Yeah. Absolutely. One of the things that I find across a lot of the work that I do is that essentially what we're doing is we're just increasing the amount of conversation that's happening. With facilitated work, it's conversation in the form of, often you're imposing some kind of constraint so that the conversations are very strictly guided in a way. But like Steve Blank, and who's the behind the I-Corps and Hacking for Defense, and he's a really great resource on innovation in the DoD. He talks about leadership by walking around or get outside the building, because and that's a really common theme for every innovation management and strategy method that I've encountered. Many of them, one of the baseline transformations that they recommend is increase the amount of conversations that are happening across silos. And that includes the vertical silos between leadership and the operational level. If you can, as a facilitator, we talk a lot about holding space. And that's because people don't naturally start a conversation with coworkers they aren't friends with unless there's like a problem or an ask, right? So they don't spend a ton of time naturally getting aligned to one another's views or becoming, becoming entrained to the same values. And so as a facilitator, honestly, like one of my most recommended facilitated methods for any organization, just to you want to level up your team's innovation capacity, start with this really simple facilitated exercise. And it comes from Agile and Scrum. I believe it might predate them, but it's called the retrospective. And when I was introduced to the retrospective, it was a weekly activity where everybody on the team, this was our Wing Innovation Office, everybody on the team would, on a Friday afternoon, we would, turn off our computers. We'd go into the room where we did retrospectives. There were comfortable chairs, and we would sit there and silently write down on sticky notes all the things that had happened that week that were good, all the things we could think of that had happened that week that were bad, and then other stuff we wanted to bring up. And then we would put them up on the board, and we dot vote on the ones that other people put up that we agreed with. So a really interesting thing happens. And then after you've put them all up, somebody who's facilitating goes, who wants to talk about this one? And then you go one by one. You have a conversation with the team about the most important things, the wave tops of what happened that week. And you have this, the silent part is actually really important, because silent generation allows everybody to have a voice. And it gives people room and space to think of things that they wouldn't in the course of, like a fast moving conversation. And it does these really amazing things. But one of the most incredible, in addition to just bringing stuff up and being like, oh, we needed to do something about that. Right. So it's an obvious, weak signal detection mechanism for finding opportunities for innovation. Cause you just, oh, here's an action item based on this week's retrospective. It also has this incredible aligning function. And I've spent a lot of time as a facilitator and thinking about the culture of organizations. I've written a lot on the subject of alignment, because I think that when you do practices like that, where you increase the conversational capacity of your organization and you get people aligned culturally and strategically, you don't run into that problem of, hey, here's an idea, or here's a solution, and then realizing that person is thinking something completely opposite from what you are, which is, what you're talking about with the frozen middle. It's that you aren't actually on the same page as that person at all. So if you're in the same organization working towards the same goals, you should be strategically aligned. But in order to be strategically aligned, you need more than just like action orders or an artifact that says your organizational values, which is why I tell organizations to co-create their values with the team, because having values doesn't mean anything unless everybody's aligned to them. So sorry, that was a bit of a
no, it's okay. It's okay. This is awesome. And so that resonates with me because we spend a lot of time on being a new organization, trying to get people aligned to what we're doing. And we've got 11 different locations spread across the United States. And so there's people I'm never going to see. There's airmen I'm never going to get a chance to interact with. Maybe virtually, they can see me, but I'll never see them. And so when I go out and travel now after COVID here and do unit visits, I take this 1-page infographic that talks about where we're aligned and what our strategy is. And so,
and I'd say if you're attempting to do that as a wing commander, you're attempting to do that at scale, but that can't be on you. Like that happens. Alignment happens as a result of conversations. You can't have conversations with everybody at best you can broadcast to everybody in the organization. But even that, that would be a challenge, right? To do on a regular basis. So what has to happen is you have to have multiple tiers of regular conversations happening that are bringing people into alignment, and then make sure that those tiers have have conversations. I'm actually thinking like this was popping into my head right now is Team of Teams, which is one of the books that I derive a ton of innovation theory from. And what they did in the Joint Task Force included a weekly 1-hour call with the entire organization where anybody is welcome to speak up. Which, if you think about it for an organization, I think they went into detail on that in One Mission, or is it One Mission, by Chris Fussell. And it's, when I heard about that, I was like, I can't imagine a squadron doing a 1-hour weekly conversation.
Yeah.
Or I don't even see that happen at the flight level, right?
Right.
A 1-hour weekly conversation, but it should probably, right? Because conversation is the only technology that brings people into alignment. You can push values on people and you can push strategy on people, but they need to talk to each other in order to disambiguate and to actually integrate that into the way they think, and to figure out, well, what does that mean in my context? Strategy is often so abstract that it's like, what does that have to do with me?
Right. Well, it's interesting. We took this approach with, the racial violence that was happening, COVID,
yes.
and the insurrection stuff, January 6th at the Capitol last year. Like, we forced those conversations, and it felt natural for us to do that. Like, we got to be able to export that into the innovation field and think about the way we do business and treat it that way. And we bring our leaders, squadron commanders, senior staff, and the senior listed leaders together every 6 months to talk about it. And I think I haven't taken that next step, right? So I've said, hey, here's a strategy and alignment. Here's the why we're doing it. but I have engaged them about, and so and now that we talk through this, I see cracks in that alignment throughout the next 6 months. I'm like, well, what do you mean you don't understand? Like, we talked about this. No, that was me telling them they were not bought into it. So this is really helpful. That next step, I think, is we need to spend time just talking about it and getting people different perspectives and views on why that doesn't make sense to them.
Yeah, 100%. One of the books that I recommend, like, to the most people on the subject of why you need facilitated practices is called Liminal Thinking. It's by Dave Gray. It's a really interesting book about how how cognition happens and how our perceptions are even, there's a feed forward mechanism in the OODA loop that our expectations dictate what we see. And like, we don't even see the same things as each other. The only way to disambiguate, to like get into alignment about that, is to use better technologies than or social technologies is one term I like to use. So yeah, liminal thinking. I've also been spending a lot of time recently. I'm working on a fun project called Meeting Design, where if you think about meetings as the operating system of an organization, right? That's where the interactional, like, computation happens. It's where sense making ideally happens. But most organizations don't think of meetings as a useful technology. They just kind of borrow practices that it seems like other people think they need to be doing. And so you end up with these dull, lifeless slideshows, that last for hours. And it's like, well, why are we all sitting here looking at program managers' slides? Do we know what these numbers mean? Do we act based on them? So if you think about meetings as the organizational operating system, and you kind of are aware of alternatives, like you find in the Scrum framework, right? You got your daily stand-up, you got your retrospectives. Daily stand-up is a really interesting approach. There's also like this Amazon meeting where they all start the meeting silently reading the same document for like 20 minutes, which I really like, because nobody's privileged going into that. You all just read the exact same thing, and now you're going to talk about it together, and it kind of levels the playing field for discussions. So there are these alternative methods and approaches to sense making together that increase psychological safety, that generate action-oriented outputs, for example, that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And it's why I'm so excited about facilitation, is because there's just so many opportunities to implement. When you think about what is our meeting system, how often do we have this type of conversation, and therefore what can we expect our alignment to even be? So yeah, that's
great. Yeah. So we, as even a new organization, we fell in some of those pitfalls about, well, this is the way, meetings are done and wings have previously been, and let's do that. And so, and I'm trying to talk about, hey, we're new wing, like, we get the chance to rebuild this. We don't have this institutional knowledge that's telling us we have to do things differently. So we have taken some different approaches of trying to use data to make decisions, only present data that's ready for decision. Not do PowerPoint slides, but show actual data from source data. And I asked the question, why are we looking at this data? If it's not for decision, then lower level leaders need to make their decisions based on it. Why do I need to as wing commander? So, so we're trying to do some of that. But I found fascinating when I read the story, you've probably read this too, about Google studied what makes some teams perform better than others. And they spent like 2 years studying all these different teams, and they come to find out that it was something as simple as the teams that performed better knew more about each other, were well aligned, and had this sense of empathy for each other. And often they started their meetings with, hey, everybody talk about what happened last weekend. And the story goes that there's one guy that was part of the team that was struggling with something like you did with your daughter. with cancer in his immediate family, and nobody knew about that. And as soon as he opened up about it, they talked about it, like that team's performance went off the chart. And so
Yeah.
it's fascinating. Those simple things that we just often don't think about can be the key to unlock, the airman's potential. And me as a senior leader, I feel like that's my job, is to create that culture and environment for those things to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of hits on, I think, that even the metaphors we use often when we talk about the institution, they're very mechanistic. We think in terms of machines, like a unit or a wing or something. Like we could reduce it down to its component parts and make it really, really efficient. And I actually kind of blame our employment. There's like scientific management from Frederick Taylor, and there's I actually kind of blame the process improvement methods that we employ as well, because they were sort of perfected in the factory floor setting, right?
Yep.
Or the Toyota, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with trying to translate a factory floor to a dynamic knowledge work environment, which is a majority of the Air Force, are people engaged in, as well as the fact that when you start talking about the impact of culture, you can't just be thinking in terms of the mechanistic processes of work. You have to think about the weird and complex processes of trust and alignment and all of that, which is to say that I think one of the things that's really harming us is we're sticking with those mechanistic ordered domain metaphors. And so one of the things that I actually talk about a ton is complexity, because I'm a big fan of I don't know if you've heard of the Cynefin framework.
I have not,
but I did a YouTube video on it trying to introduce it. It's not a very accessible set of theories, but the framework itself, I talk about it constantly because it's so useful. It basically just really quickly describes that there are a couple of kinds of systemic states. One of them is the ordered system, and an ordered system is contained and it can be reduced to its component parts. So like an airplane is an ordered system. It's enclosed, and if you take it apart and you carry it somewhere else and you put it back together, it's the same airplane and it's still going to take off. Complex systems aren't like that. So that's like the most useful part of the Cynefin framework, is the difference between ordered systems and complex systems. And this is related to the mechanistic versus the organic metaphors I was talking about. And the difference is that in an ordered domain, you can come up with best practices and just keep using them, and they'll work over and over and over, right?
Yep.
But in a complex domain, that's not the case. The only way to make sense, the heuristics they offer in complexity are to probe the system and then sense what its current state is and then respond. So like a really obvious example of that would be like in warfare, you can't reduce it down to its component parts. They're all so interrelated and interacting and in constant evolution that the only way to make a decision is to go, let's get a snapshot of right now and then start experimenting and see what gets us the patterns that we want to see. So, one of the problems with thinking we're going to make this system more efficient is that efficiency is something you can pursue really well in ordered systems. But when you are so hyper-focused on efficiency in a complex domain, like on a team, you will lose track of the factors that are driving, lost capacity or the environment's changing. You talked about the warfighting, the cyber environment we're falling behind, technologically and in terms of processes. I think a lot of it has to do with that we don't act like an organic system. We act like a mechanistic one.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, that's great. Well, hey, we're running out of time, but I wanted to address this one thing that you said that I found really, really insightful. And I think our airmen can really take some lessons from it. So I'd offer you to share some comments with it. So, and I'm going to quote you. It says, "You can't fall in love with solutions. We have to fall in love with problems." And so
Yeah.
that's really insightful.
Yeah, I love that. I don't remember where I originally got that, but it seems to be a really common theme for people to latch on to something they believe is definitely going to solve all the problems and then get really, disheartened when they realize that other people aren't bought in or they don't believe in it. Or they'll persist. We talked about the value of persistence earlier. I've been guilty of this plenty of times. You persist because you know that it would solve the problem. One of my favorite examples of this is actually communication tools, because we like to think that if we just adopt Slack, or if we just adopt Teams, or if we just get on platform ones matter most, it'll solve our communication issues. So I've done this at many locations using many platforms. I'm in the habit of standing up new communication tools, and I have my preferred tool, and I have fallen into the trap of just trying to push it on people and it not working at all. And I get so frustrated. I'm like, you don't understand this. This will solve your problem if you just use it the way it needs to be used. But like I said earlier, that behavior change is a make or break factor. So if a terrible tool that they would actually adopt exists, that would solve the problem way better than a feature-rich, commercial platform. Which is why, human-centered design, it's all about what invokes that behavior change. So that's why you start with what problem are we experiencing and what would resolve it? Like, what behavior would resolve it? What behavior would we see? What are the measures of effectiveness? And then for every solution, no matter how elegant it seems, you have to be willing to just go, yep, that's not creating the value we decided was most important here. And that's why having a process like user experience design or human-centered design or design thinking is so important, because it builds in the right order. Starts with that problem and the creation of value for human beings. And it keeps returning to that over and over. Right.
Yeah, I think you got to continue to ask the question and make sure you're solving the right problem too, right? And so, you got to get some buy-in on what the problem is and then attack it from there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that frozen middle problem is that there are plenty of people who don't think that what you're telling them is a problem. They just think, they're like, oh, that might be a problem for you, but it's not for the system.
Right.
So if people within the system can experience a problem, but the system continues to function, that might be a cultural issue. But, we do tend to privilege it's getting the job done. Like the mission has to come first. Right. So, but in an organization, I would argue that in an organization that's reflecting and having those conversations, you can deconflict. Like, people don't have to be miserable or crushed in the gears of the machine. So I also think that it's really important to privilege people's experience as well in those conversations.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, you are doing amazing work, and I don't know what to call you. I don't think it matters, an innovator, a disruptor, or human-centered design experts, me, but you are crushing it. And I really appreciate your time today, sharing your experiences and your story with our gladiators. And certainly we want to be able to help support you and continue to learn more from you. So I'm going to tell all of our listeners to check out his YouTube channel. Check out the podcast for sure that he's a co-host of. Find the TEDx talk he did, and follow him on all the social media stuff. I know I'm following him on LinkedIn. And so Really great stuff and insightful. And again, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. And best of luck to you in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
Excellent. Yeah. And if, I always tell this, if you're ever interested in being a reservist, look us up. We got lots of opportunities.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.